Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you some additional information about creating a question for the historical investigation when you guys work on that preliminary proposal, which is very much really an opportunity to read a lot and find resources that help you understand a topic that you're interested in. One of the outcomes of that proposal is to develop one or two or maybe even three potential questions that you'll pursue. And it is really hard to come up with a question that's really going to frame your historical investigation. So these are just a couple of tips in terms of how to really word and how to really think about that particular task of writing a question. So the first piece of advice I would suggest is definitely use the beginning phrase, "to what extent," as a way to introduce your question, and a little bit more on that in a little bit. But this idea of "to what extent" enables a question to be asked so that it's not a how question or what question or when question. If you ask something like, how did the Salem witch trial start, what you end up as a answer is a whole bunch of a list of, a whole bunch of topics on a list that would maybe describe some of the reasons why the Salem witch trial started. If we pick one of those reasons and we ask, to what extent did kind of a lack of empowerment for colonial women in Salem, Massachusetts, lead to the Salem witch trials, then we kind of have something we can work with. It was either to some great extent, not to a great extent, and I'm able to work with that. This phrase, "to what extent," helps you develop multiple sides of an argument, and it also forces the topic to be narrowed down a little bit. So let's look at an example of how to narrow down a topic. Say that I'm a kid who's really interested in the American Revolution. So I might come up with a question like, what caused the American Revolution? But with this type of question, I'm going to get a list of things, and because it's such a broad topic, I'm going to get a really big list of things. I'm going to come up with things like taxes, or I'm going to maybe think about things that happened to Great Britain, maybe even way before the American Revolution. So there's this endless list of answers to that question. So that's too broad. Maybe I could make it a little bit more specific and ask, how did taxes lead to the American Revolution? So that's a little more narrow, but it's still also really big because there's a lot of taxes that were imposed on the colonists right before the American Revolution. So a recommendation might be to pick one. So I might do, how did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the American Revolution? This is much more narrow because I can more easily examine the effects of the 1765 Stamp Act and how that might have created some unrest in the colonies. And then I have to see, can I actually draw some lines to did it cause the American Revolution? That's kind of broad. The second part of that question is still really broad because lots of things led to the American Revolution, so I might want to focus it even some more. And something I have to remember is I want my question to be open-ended, that there's going to be multiple answers to the question. I want a question in a sense that's almost going to invite a little bit of a debate, and I also need my question to be measurable. How am I going to know the answer to the question? How would I know if the Stamp Act led to the American Revolution? I have to be able to kind of come up with something that I can use evidence and actually know the answer. So if I worked on the question some more, I might come up with something. How did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the creation of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts? Okay, this is indeed better. The beginning of my question is a little bit more narrow. I'm looking at the effects of the 1765 Stamp Act, and I'm looking at for those effects on the creation of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts. Okay, and I probably could develop some evidence that would help me see the link between those two things. So it's definitely a better question, but it's still asking for a list. The how part in the beginning of this question is basically asking for, this way and this way and this way, a list. So if I say, to what extent did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the creation of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts? If I ask that question, now I kind of invite debate. Either the Stamp Act really did kind of strongly lead to the creation of the Sons of Liberty, maybe it didn't at all, or maybe it did for some people and not necessarily others, or maybe it started something and then other factors also kind of had an impact. So it forces me to kind of weigh the amount, how much did the Stamp Act actually make a difference in the creation of the Sons of Liberty? And this is measurable because if I start looking and researching the founding documents of the Sons of Liberty and the first people to kind of start identifying themselves as members of the Sons of Liberty, how much is the Stamp Act actually part of their discussion? So it's something that I could look up in text and find a way to create an argument to make that connection, or to say, no, I looked in all these pieces of evidence and I don't see any evidence of the Stamp Act being part of the reason why this was actually created, okay? So these are also just two sample questions that students from last year picked. So the very top one is from Ivan Wu, and his question is, to what extent did Alexander's, and he means Alexander the Great, but to what extent did Alexander's military tactics in the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC allow the Macedonians to win the battle? So this is a question that's really about, how much did Alexander's military tactics matter in order to win this battle? And this is a really common debate amongst historians, and some of the counter arguments. If it wasn't Alexander's military tactics, he opposed Darius, a Persian. Maybe it was Darius's mistakes. Some historians also argue that maybe the terrain was part of the reason that Alexander's forces had an advantage. So, how much was it Alexander's military tactics? Was he really responsible for winning this battle? The evidence could be posed so that the student could construct a conclusion, okay? And the student may not know when posing the question in the beginning of the HI what the answer is. So it's kind of a question that really depends on a thorough investigation of the evidence. The second question has to do with the Protestant Reformation. To what extent did Johann Tetzel's preaching of indulgences at the University of Wittenberg in 1517 cause Martin Luther to write the 95 Theses and start the Reformation? So this is a question where the student, it happened to be Michael Gomez, was really interested in, why did Martin Luther start the Reformation? Why did he kick off the 95 Theses as kind of complaints against the Roman Catholic Church? What was he interested in? What were the reasons for this? And in his research, he kept seeing the name, Johann Tetzel as this individual who perhaps was, instigating a reaction from Martin Luther. And the student wanted to know how much was that kind of the driving force. And some of this might be related to timing. Was it that Martin Luther's 95 Theses coincided with some of the activities of Johann Tetzel? So the student had to research that and find out, did the evidence suggest that, or perhaps were there other reasons why Martin Luther wrote the 95 Theses? Maybe there were other individuals or other circumstances that presented themselves that created the motivation for him to write that. So the parts that aren't in the question become almost as important as some of the things that are in the question. But I hope that helps a little bit to give you an idea. Note that the two students who wrote these questions didn't start out with these questions. They started out with an interest in Alexander the Great, and ultimately they probably wanted to know about all different military battles, and then found that the narrowing process brought them to one particular battle. And the same thing with the Reformation was an interest, a topic that a student researched, and then it became all about, how and why did, how, to what extent Tetzel was perhaps involved in causing Martin Luther to write the 95 Theses. Okay, so in any case, I hope that helped a little bit in terms of coming up with a question. If you have more, questions about the preliminary proposal, feel free to ask in class. Have a good night.